Good evening, visitors. Welcome to the Australian War Memorial's last post ceremony. My name is Craig Burrell, and joining us today from the Royal Australian Air Force is Squadron Leader Stacey Davids. On this day, 105 years ago, the men of the Australian Imperial Force took part in a major operation to break the Hindenburg Line. The last and strongest line of German defence on the Western Front, the Hindenburg Line was a series of deep, interconnected trenches, dugouts and concrete machine gun emplacements, which were laid out 15 kilometres deep and more than 60 kilometres wide. The Australians had fought hard to reach the most formidable section of the defences, the St Quentin Canal. 2 metres deep with banks 10 metres high, the canal obstructed infantry and tanks alike. On the 29th of September 1918, the operation to breach this heavily defended part of the line was launched across the Bellicourt Tunnel by American and Australian troops, supported by British Corps on the flanks. The inexperienced Americans struggled to clear the ground of German defenders. The Australians launched the second phase of the operation into a confused morass of men and bodies, unsure of where their partners, the Americans, were, or whether or not they had been able to establish a line on their objective. In the end, the canal was first breached by the 46th British Midlands Division on the right flank of the Australian and American attack. Their advance under one of the heaviest artillery barrages yet seen materially aided the Australians with making progress across the tunnel. After 4 days of battle, with heavy losses on both sides, the Germans were forced to retreat. This evening, we are honoured to acknowledge Ms May Kuen Chong, Director of the National Museum of Singapore, and the accompanying delegation. We welcome the veterans who have served, those that are still serving, and the families that love and support them. The live stream of this ceremony is made possible by the Return and Services League of Australia and the RSL and Services Clubs Association. We welcome members who are watching the broadcast of this ceremony across Australia. During the ceremony, wreaths will be laid at the base of the pool of reflection by visitors to the memorial. If you are able, please stand and join in singing the National Anthem. Please be seated if you can do so. The Australian War Memorial was the vision of Charles Bean, Australia's First World War official historian. Bean landed with the Australian troops on Gallipoli and stayed with them at the front through to the end of the war. The idea of this national memorial and museum came to him at Pozières, France, in the depths of the bloody fighting of 1916. Bean's idea was that this would be a place where families and friends could mourn their loved ones buried in faraway places. It would also be a place that could help all Australians understand what these men and women had endured and what they had done for us. Bean's vision, to which we remain true, is best expressed as inscribed in the entrance to the memorial's galleries. Here is their spirit, in the heart of the land they loved, and here we guard the record which they themselves made. Tonight, We will read the story behind just one of those on the Roll of Honour, which lists the names of more than 103,000 men and women who have given their lives for us in war and on operations for more than a century. But first, we present a lament, Flowers of the Forest. Wreaths or floral tributes will now be laid at the base of the pool of reflection.
Today, we remember and pay tribute to Lieutenant Colonel Robert Oswald Henderson. Robert Henderson was born on the 27th of March, 1874, in Bendigo, Victoria. He was one of 8 children born to Thomas Hope Henderson, proprietor of Bendigo's Beehive Store, and his wife, Marion. Robert attended Bendigo High School. From an early age, he took a keen interest in his local community, and as an adult, was on the committees of organizations including the local hospital, Benevolent Asylum, and Masonic Lodge. When Robert was 25, his father died, leaving Robert to take over as the proprietor of the Beehive Store. In July 1904, Robert married Maud Anderson Bush in a small ceremony held at Bendigo's St. Paul's Cathedral. Their first child, Dorothea, was born 4 years later, A son, Robert, was born in 1913. Robert remained an active member of the Citizens Military Force and was in command of the 67th Infantry when the First World War broke out in 1914. He was mobilized, first under orders to establish and equip a military training camp on the Epsom racecourse. After serving in a headquarters role for 2 years, Robert offered himself for overseas service with the Australian Imperial Force. He enlisted in February 1916 and was assigned to the 38th Battalion with the rank of Major. He embarked for overseas service soon after, sailing from Melbourne in June aboard the troop ship Runic. After several weeks at sea, Major Henderson arrived in England in August 1916. After 3 months in camp, he traveled to the Western Front, arriving just in time to spend a bitterly cold winter in the trenches. In the new year, Henderson was transferred to the 39th Battalion. Having been promoted to Lieutenant Colonel, he became its new commanding officer. He spent the first few months of 1917 pursuing the enemy as it made a strategic retreat towards a new fortified front line. After attending a school of instruction behind the lines in April, he and his men were sent to Belgium, where they would take part in their first major battle of the war, when the Allies attacked enemy positions at Messines Ridge in June 1917. Despite the majority of the battalion being badly gassed at the outset of the battle, it managed to capture its objectives and spent the weeks which followed helping to hold the ground taken. In October, the 39th Battalion fought at Broomcinder Ridge and then Passchendaele. Henderson was later awarded the Distinguished Service Order for his leadership during these battles, as well as noting his absolute indifference to danger. His recommendation remarked, "When his battalion reached their objective, he personally supervised digging in and reorganization. He then remained in the shell holes with his men, his cheerfulness and high spirits having a wonderful effect in keeping up their courage and spirits." The 39th Battalion saw out the next 5 months in the Belgian sector, rotating in and out of the front lines throughout a wet and muddy winter. Henderson was wounded in the hand during a routine operation and was sent to England for treatment. He rejoined his unit in June 1918 and was soon drawn into the fighting when the Allies launched a major offensive in August. The offensive quickly proved devastating for German forces, setting in motion a series of defeats that pushed the enemy back to its final row of defense, known as the Hindenburg Line. On the 29th of September 1918, Henderson and the men of the 39th Battalion took part in their final major action of the war. Operating alongside American troops, they were tasked with breaching the enemy's defenses along the St. Quentin Canal. Attacking strongly defended sectors with tanks, aircraft, and artillery, they managed to break through the enemy lines. As they pushed towards the ruins of a nearby farm, victory was in sight. Taking cover in a shell hole, Henderson looked over the edge and was hit by enemy fire, which caused a fatal wound to the head. Fighting continued for several more days, after which time the Germans, faced with being outflanked, were forced to continue their withdrawal. Although they hastened an end to the war in breaking the Hindenburg Line, the Australians suffered more than 2,500 casualties in 4 days of fighting. News of Henderson's death reached Australia and was received by his family and the people of Bendigo with much sadness. The Bendigonian reported, "Henderson was a fearless soldier and left his home as others had done because he considered it to be his duty. He had secured the DSO by his own personal valor, leading his men and taking risks when he might have remained behind and awaited reports. The death of such a man, who was always one of our best and honored citizens, is a terrible loss to the community." Robert Henderson was 43 years old. His name is listed on the Roll of Honor on my right, among almost 62,000 Australians who died while serving in the First World War. His photograph is displayed today by the Pool of Reflection. This is but one of the many stories of service and sacrifice told here at the Australian War Memorial. We now remember Lieutenant Colonel Robert Oswald Henderson, who gave his life for us, for our freedoms, and in the hope of a better world.
Please stand for the reading of the Ode and the sounding of the last post.
They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them. Lest we forget.
Lest we forget. We leave you this evening with the words of the memorial's founder, Charles Bean. Many a man lying out there at Pozieres or in the low scrub at Gallipoli, with his poor, tired senses barely working through the fever of his brain, has thought in his last moments, well, it's over. But in Australia, they will be proud of this. Ladies and gentlemen, girls and boys, that concludes the last post ceremony. On behalf of the Director, staff and volunteers, we thank you for visiting the Australian War Memorial today and for your continued support during the Memorial's development project. We wish you all a very pleasant evening.